particular talk is all about volunteerism. And for the most part, my journey, how I got into it, the impact it's had on my life, what I've seen of volunteerism over time in terms of what I think is needed for the world to heal and for the world to do better. And so I'm just going to jump right into it. When I stop and look at my journey related to human trafficking and to volunteerism, it happened about 30 years ago. I was in Nepal. I was a public health officer, and my job basically was to translate resources into healthier people. What we were finding at that time were girls that were 12, 13 years old who were HIV positive. Now, if you know anything about Nepal, it's a very conservative culture. We should not have found that disease among that age group. So we went to go and interview the women and the girls. What we heard was basically the same story over and over again. And the story went something like this. A human trafficker would go into a community, flash a bunch of money around, and say, I'm looking for a wife. He'd say, I don't want an urban wife, I want a village wife. He'd find a girl, 11, 12 years old, befriend her, and then go to the family and say, I'd like to marry your daughter. Now, for most of us, that age would be perceived as very young, but in Nepal, it wasn't. People got married very early. So they would actually go through a wedding ceremony. The entire community would be there. After the wedding ceremony, you would have a situation where the trafficker would go to the family and say, I'm going to take your daughter to Kathmandu, the capital, but don't worry, I'll be back again in 3 months. But that isn't what's going to happen. Instead of taking her to Kathmandu, he takes her to Mumbai, India. Now you got to remember that this girl has never been more than 20 kilometers away from her home. When she's in India, she thinks she's still in Nepal. He then puts her in a room and he says, honey, stay here. I'll be back in a few minutes. As she was coming into this area, she saw all these women dressed funny, these men milling around. She says to her husband, no, don't leave me. I'm scared. He says, it's okay. You just stay here. I'll be back in a few minutes. He then goes to the madam to get the $500 for having sold her to the brothel. He has the gold from the wedding, and he hands the wedding pictures over to the madam. He then leaves to go to Nepal to do this again and again and again, maybe 40, 50 times in a year. After that, madam goes into the room where the girl is and says, guess what? Your husband just sold you to me, and you're going to be with 20 guys a day, every day, because I say so. You can imagine her shock. No, my husband loves me. No, that's what happened. When she comes to internalize this, many of the girls say, I will kill myself before I do those shameful things. The madam then brings out the photograph of the wedding and says, is this your mother, your father, your brother? If you hurt yourself, we will hurt them. So she's trapped in this situation. In order to make her into a prostitute, it's quite simple. You simply shame her. So they bring in a couple of professional rapists, and over a 2-day period of time, they will rape this 12-year-old girl 30 times until eventually she just lays back and accepts whatever happens to her. After that, she's put on the line, which means that she will be with 20 guys a day, every day, for about 2 years until she gets what's called black eye, where she's so depleted physically and emotionally and spiritually that nobody wants her. So they take her and throw her out onto the street. If she's lucky, she got back to Nepal. Many of them never did. They languished in India, had AIDS, and died. And I was seeing the ones that made it back. Now, when I was kind of in this situation, I didn't really understand the evil of the situation until I actually went to those brothels. I was invited by the Indian government to do public health checks. I had a police officer with me. I went into one of the brothels and there was an 11-year-old trafficking victim. This girl saw me, saw an opportunity, literally ran up and wrapped herself around me, said, save me, save me. They're doing terrible things to me. I looked down at this child who was hysterically crying, wearing a dress 20 sizes too big because she was a child in an adult's world. I turned to the police officer, said, we need to get this girl out of here. He said, we can't do that. I said, how come? You're a cop. He says, if we try to leave, they'll kill us both. To make a long story short, We left, we came back with a lot more police, but of course she was gone. Now I tell this story because I wasn't one of those 15-year-olds that said when I grow up, I want to be an activist. In fact, I did everything I could not to be an activist. But every once in a while, we are tested in life. This was my big test. I was supposed to get that girl out of there. I failed miserably. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat. All I thought about were the dozens of scenarios of what I could have done if I had an opportunity to do this again. And then what I did is eventually, having come to the point where I kind of accepted this failure, I did what a lot of activists eventually do, is I surrendered to the fact that now that I know about this situation, this is what I'm going to do with my life, because I didn't have a choice. I didn't pick this particular topic. This topic picked me. And you'll hear me say this over and over again. We don't pick our causes pick us. Before I go to my next slide, I just want to explain why it is that you would have children in brothels in India. And the reason for this is that there are 3 myths. The first myth is, if you have sex with a child, you can't get a disease. Wrong. Secondly, if you have a disease and you have sex with a child, you can get rid of your disease. Wrong. Third, if you're old and tired and have sex with a child, you can get some of their vitality. Wrong. The reality is, if you have sex with a child, she is going to bleed, she's going to have damage in her genitals, she's going to get a disease, and she's eventually going to die. And so as I came to accept the fact that there are 4.2 million people in this situation, and I've seen it firsthand, and I've seen all these girls in Nepal, as I say, I surrendered to the fact that that's what I'm going to do. Now, when it comes to the issue of human trafficking, it's not just about women and girls. It's also about men and boys. What you see here is a fishing boat. I lived and worked in Thailand for 10 years, and one of the issues we faced were fishing boats that had slave labor on them. The story goes something like this. A Cambodian boy, 14, 15 years old, is told by his family, you got to go to Thailand, find a job, and send money home. We need it to basically cover our costs so that we can eat, so that we can live, and so the boy is sent off. He's in Thailand looking for work, not finding it. Eventually what happens is traffickers in those communities see this, go up to him and say, hey brother, you're from Cambodia, I'm from Cambodia. It looks like you need some help. Let me help you out. Let me lend you some money. Okay, well now that you have my money, you have to stay with me, but guess what? I got this great job. Let's go down to the ocean. I'll put you on a boat. The boat will go out for a couple of months. You'll catch a bunch of fish. Come on, you're a guy. Guys love fishing, right? After that, the boat will come back. You'll have money in your pocket. You'll be a hero to everyone. So they go down to the ocean. He goes onto the boat. He doesn't realize he's been sold onto the boat. The boat goes out, but it doesn't come back after 3 months. It stays out for 4 years. This poor kid will end up working 17, 18, 19 hours a day, every day. If he doesn't, he gets beaten, he gets tortured, they take food away, water away from him. The only food he will eat the entire time he's there is rice and fish. Nothing nutritious, no fruits, no vegetables. You can imagine what that's going to do to his body. They often give strong stimulants, drugs, to get him to work. And that wreaks havoc on his body. If he gets injured, if he gets sick, they throw him off the side of the boat. At the end of the 4 years, the boat comes in, guy goes to the captain and says, give me something. Captain says, go away. You're illegally in my country. The guy says, I will go and tell the police what you did. Captain says, go ahead. We own the police. This is another example of human trafficking. And you can see, while it isn't the same as sex trafficking, it still steals a person's life. It's devastating to them. It takes their hopes and dreams and aspirations away from them. It is a horrible situation. I'll give you one more example. I lived in Bangladesh for 5 years. And during the time that I was there, one of the biggest issues we faced were infants 2-year-olds that were being trafficked from Bangladesh to the Middle East. Now, those of you who are parents know that a 2-year-old doesn't have the concentration, the manual dexterity to do repetitive work. What do you do with an infant? You put them on the back of a camel. Why? Because if you put an infant on the back of a camel, what does the infant do? They kick and scream. What does the camel do? It runs. So they race camels, they bet on the races, and they use infants because they are small and they are light and they will not slow the camel down. Assuming the child lives to age 5, and many of them don't because they fall off and get trampled, they are beginning to gain weight. They're beginning to slow the camel down. So they take these kids and throw them out onto the street. So at a time when most 5-year-old boys are starting their education in kindergarten, you have a 5-year-old boy in a foreign country, doesn't speak the language, nobody to support him, he doesn't have anyone to give him anything. You can imagine what type of life that child is going to have. Once again, another example of human trafficking. When it comes to the number of people who are in this situation, it's about 40 million people. In fact, there are more slaves today than any other time in history. About 9.2 million people enter per year. In a single day, 25,200 people somewhere in the world are entering into modern slavery, or a new slave every 4 seconds. So if I count to 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, somewhere in the world, somebody's entering into modern slavery. Could be India, could be Ghana, could be Peru, could be the United States, could be Australia. Somewhere in the world, this is happening. And the drum beats on and on and on and on. So I was hearing about this, and the more I was hearing about it, because in my DNA, there was something that drew me to this particular topic, I kept getting deeper and deeper and deeper involved in this issue. While my full-time job was public health for the US government, I started volunteering. And initially it was an hour a week, then it was 2 hours a week, then it was an hour a day, and then eventually got to a point where it was anywhere from 5 to 10 hours a day. Now, as I was doing that, somebody might say, well, you know, here it is, you're in this situation, you're working, you're doing that. Isn't it taking away from your life? Well, not at all. And you'll see as I go into this presentation why. Okay, so there's 40 million people in modern slavery. There's about 20,000 do-gooders like me around the world that address this issue. Out of the 40 million people, I'm going to show you how many of them were helped last year out of modern slavery. Think about what a good number is. And then I'm going to show you out of the 500,000 criminals, how many of them were put in jail. So here are the results. Last year, out of 40 million people, about 100,000 people were helped. That's 0.2% of the victims being addressed. Not even a 0.5%, not even a percent. When it comes to the number of criminals, out of 500,000 greed incentivized criminals, about 8,000, 0.8%. Wow. When you look at this, you might ask the question, does the counter-trafficking world not care? Are we lazy? Well, the reason for this is the profits generated from modern slavery are estimated to be about 150 billion US dollars a year. The amount of money that's available to fight it is about 350 million, or 0.2%. You can see what it is that we're up against. And since COVID has hit, that 40 million number can be thrown out the window. We anticipate that up to 60 million people or more will be in modern slavery. Why? Because if you're in Bangladesh and you rely on that paycheck at the garment factory, and the garment factory closes because no orders are coming in from North America, and even if they were, nobody's buying anything because there's so many people who have issues, you're sent home. You're sitting there with the rest of your family members. You eventually tap into your savings. You use them up in a couple of months because you don't have much in the way of savings. And what do? You borrow money. And once you borrowed money, you're in a situation where you have to pay that money back. If you don't have any way of doing that, then the traffickers are going to come and say, I need a family member to come with me for a year, maybe 2 years, to pay up the debt. and we will see a significant increase as a result of that. So the point I'm making is we have this terrible crime against humanity, something that is so big and so awful and so horrible, but yet we're having an impact that is simply a drop in the ocean. And this is an extremely important point, and I will come back to this a little bit later because it's relevant to not only human trafficking, but many of the other issues of our time. So when it comes to the question of who is responsible for addressing human trafficking, a lot of people say, well, you know, it's the government's responsibility. It's criminal activity. They have to take care of this. Some people will say, well, it's the United Nations responsibility. Some people will say, well, it's the NGOs. That's what they do. Some people will say it's the private sector. I would argue that it's all of our responsibility. Why? Because number one, a 14-year-old girl trafficked into a brothel, and over a period of time, she's commercially raped 7,000 times only to eventually get AIDS. The world has to accept responsibility for that. We all have to accept responsibility. The other part of this is that basically, if you are a consumer and you buy things, a certain percentage of what you buy is tainted by modern slavery. So we contribute to it, just like we contribute to the carbon footprint. And so by accepting that responsibility that we are a part of the problem, we should be part of the solution. Okay, so I started off as a volunteer. I did that for about 10 or 12 years. And eventually what I did is I said, this is what I want to do with my life. So I switched from the US government, USAID, to the United Nations. I ran the largest counter-trafficking program in the world. We have offices in China, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and Myanmar. As part of this work, I worked in over 40 countries. I worked on a whole variety of different developmental issues. And so what I'm going to do now is switch over to looking at some of the lessons that I've learned related to volunteerism over the years and apply some of this to my thinking related to this. So the first thing that I want to do is talk about this. And I think it's self-explanatory. Our world needs our help. When you stop and look at the various issues that we face, we have pollution and clean water and hunger and war, girls' education, forced labor, all of these things that are out there are happening in huge numbers. 5.5 million people die from pollution every year. Close to 800 million people are without clean water. Close to 800 million people go to bed hungry every day. Over 10 wars still rage around the world. 130 million girls have no access to school. We have child labor situations, 168 million children working. But what's relevant and important about all of this is when you look at the statistics for any of these things, we're failing. Most of them were under 5%. And the reason for this is that the number of government, UN, NGO, community-based organizations, private sector organizations combined isn't enough to really have much of an impact. This is an extremely important point because for us to be able to heal the world, the assumption is that we need to do stuff, and if the people doing the stuff aren't sufficient to be able to make a difference, we have to figure out another way. When it comes to community issues, it's the same type thing. You see that there are all kinds of issues at the community level: pollution, animal rights, drug abuse. We have issues related to the elderly. You name it, you have it. So whether it's Hong Kong or the UK or Thailand, every country has their own component community issues. And once again, many of these issues are not being addressed fully because the resources to do this don't exist. The second point that I want to make is to reiterate the fact that we do not pick our issues. Our issues pick us. So, you know, as a development person, I was exposed to communicable diseases. I was exposed to the issues of education. I was exposed to poverty. I was exposed to all kinds of things. And even though I care about all of those things, it was really the human trafficking issue that kept coming back to me. Every time I turned my back, it was in front of me. Every time I turned to the left, it was there, turned to the right, it was there. But there's something about who I am as a human being that draws me to that particular issue. I can't explain why the reason that is. I don't know. I have no idea why it is that I'm attracted to this, but the point is that human beings have issues. I've had volunteers that have worked for me in human trafficking, and after about 2 months, I've gone to them and said, I don't think you should work with us. And the reason I've said that is because every time I have a conversation with that person, they're talking about the environment. And my point to them is go work in an organization that basically focuses on the environment, because that's where your heart is. It's clear to me that that's what you want to be doing. So an important lesson that I learned is we have to be open to figuring out what our cause is first. And if you don't know what your cause is, you need to find that, and I'll come back to that. The second point, or the third point that I want to mention, is that by nature, people are compassionate. Those of us who have been in Hong Kong have seen this many, many times. An elderly person pushing cardboard or some type of recyclables on a cart. Now, about 8 months ago, I was in Central and I was walking down the road, and one of these women were crossing the road with their cart and everything fell off. And within literally about 5 seconds, people from every single direction were walking toward this woman. Some of the people stopped to help with the traffic. Some of the people helped to put the cardboard back on the cart. A couple of people helped her to push it to the other side. One person even said, I'm going to push it all the way to where you're going. Nobody needed to ask them to do it. It's kind of an innate type of thing. If we see something, we naturally have this inclination to want to help. Now, over time, as you get older, in some ways, we come up with reasons why, well, I shouldn't go in the road. Maybe I'll let somebody else help or whatever, but the inclination is there. And so, for example, if a person is walking and they trip and they fall, what do? We give them our hand, and we do it naturally, and we do it because that's what human beings do. Another thing that I learned was that, you know, a lot of people have this nagging feeling that they want to do something. Years ago, when I was working for the United Nations, I started to fly up to Hong Kong in order to talk to business people. And, you know, the interesting thing was I'd walk into an office and I'd see these people who seemed to have everything, power, prestige, tremendous amounts of money, but they didn't seem very happy with life. You know, I'm an NGO person. I sometimes wondered if I should have gone in that particular direction. So finally, I started asking them. I said, seems like you have everything. How come you're not jumping up and down with joy? A lot of them said, well, you know, I feel a little emptiness, a lack of purpose. And so as I came to understand, many of these people take in life, but they don't give back. So there's this imbalance, take, but they don't give anything back. If you don't give something of yourself to the world, this imbalance relates to this feeling of emptiness, a lack of purpose. And so when you get that balance so that people step up and start doing things, they immediately start feeling good about their life. They have a transformation. You know, some of my board members, when I first met them, I really felt like in some ways they were hopeless when it came to contributing to the world. They just kind of seemed to kind of go through life and let life happen. When they took on the challenge of addressing modern slavery, some of them have gone on to become do-gooder junkies. I can hardly keep up with them. They absolutely can't help themselves. Their kids are saying, wow, look at my dad, he's helping with slavery. You know, they start feeling like, wow, I don't know why I didn't do this earlier. You know, I have my job, I make my money and stuff, I do this on the side, it doesn't consume all of my time. My life is much better. And so I've come to realize that imbalance, if you can fix it, really does make a difference. Another thing that I've learned is that a lot of people have an inkling of wanting to help, but there's a little voice in their mind that says, you know, Matt, you know, I know you keep saying in your mind that you want to help, but let me just point out a couple of things. You know, these topics that you're dealing with, they're really sad. You know, you don't want to be exposed to it on a regular basis. Do you really want to step up and get involved in that? Many of us have heard these types of voices. Another thing we hear is, oh my gosh, you know, I mean, what it is that you want to do, it seems really cool and everything, but you're really busy. You know, you really don't have time to kind of devote to something like this. just to refute this particular statement, when it comes to students, yeah, students are super busy. They have homework and after school activities and many other things. But according to the statistics here in Hong Kong, the average youth spends about 2 hours on their phone and another 3 hours watching television. Somewhere within those 5 hours is probably a little bit of time to take away from the busy argument. And I dare say that for any of us and all of us, it's the same type of thing. I have nothing to offer. This is the thing that I hear most from people. You know, what can I possibly offer? Everyone has something to offer. Everyone has a skill and ability. And a little bit later, I'll talk about my 9-year-old volunteer intern, who was one of my most effective workers. I'm not going to talk about it now because I think it's better to talk about it later. But my point is, we all have God-given gifts. We have something to offer. It's not a legitimate excuse. We can all contribute at any time in our life. What if I don't like it? What if I go to that NGO and I start volunteering and it's just not for me? That would be really embarrassing. So I shouldn't do anything. When you talk to most NGOs, they would say, we would rather have a person kind of step up and try something and not like it and leave than not to try it at all. So these are the kind of things that we see going on in our mind. Another thing that I think contributes to this is many of us are privileged. We live good lives. We had the ability to kind of decide what we do with our life. We have free time and so forth, but we feel content in our life. You know, when you ask a person how they are, I'm fine, thanks. And what that translates into, yeah, life is okay. Life is moving forward. If you don't feel the pain and suffering of what I described, you're not going to care about it. If you don't care, you're not going to do anything. So we need to get beyond our contentment. We need to risk looking at and experiencing and feeling the pain that goes along with some of the issues that are out there, because by doing that, what we are able to do is basically to get people to start feeling some of the things that the people out there in the world need. And so not too long ago, I was in Singapore and I got up on stage, and sometimes I get really animated and I almost kind of go into a trance, and I just get into a rant. And the rant that I was kind of focusing on was, you know, the fact that we need all these people, we need to get people involved. Why don't people do this, et cetera, et cetera. And I kind of, after about 10 minutes, realized that I was in this kind of a freaky phase, and I stopped myself. But afterwards, I had somebody come up to me and say, your speech was all about validity. And I said, excuse me? Yeah, validity. Now, I don't know how many of you know what that word means, but I didn't know what it was. I could hardly pronounce it. And so I looked up the word, and the word means a wish or inclination not strong enough to lead to action. And this person was right, because what happens is many of us have velleity. We have this desire to get up to the line and do something, but not enough to get over the line. And that's really kind of the issue of our time. How do we take that inclination? How do we take that desire? How do we take that urge? How do we take that kind of sense of emptiness? How do we take that lack of purpose and translate that into people stepping up and doing something? And so basically I did a TED Talk, and as part of the TED Talk, what I did is I talked about that process. I didn't realize it was validity yet, but kind of the way the world works is, let's say that you are hearing about human trafficking for the first time. So you hear about it, then you get interested in the topic, then you look more into it, then you get to the point where you really want to do something, you get up right up to that line, but once again, you don't cross over. Crossing over that line is one of the biggest, most important, relevant things for the world to understand. And it's kind of like what the marketers do for you getting and buying clothing from a store. One of the biggest issues a clothing brand has is to get a person to walk through the threshold of their store just once. Once they do that, they'll do it again and again and again, but getting them to do that is part of the problem. So we need to understand this particular topic. So what do we need to do as part of this process? What we need to do is to identify heroes. Now, I'm going to ask a question, and I can't see you all, but I'm going to ask how many of you would self-identify as being a hero? Okay, I'm looking at you and I don't see anybody. This is exactly what I often hear. And the reason for that is because for most of us, a hero is that person who runs into a burning building, grabs the kid and runs out, or an elderly woman's about to be hit by a bus and they run and they risk their life in order to do that. I'm going to redefine what heroism is. To me, a hero is a person who does a selfless act with for another person or for the earth with no intention of getting anything in return. It's a kindness. It's a kind gesture. Okay, so let me ask the question again. How many of you, based on that definition, would define yourself as being a hero? I want to see some hands. Come on, every single one of you has done a kind gesture at least once. If you don't raise your hand, you haven't ever helped anybody. And I wouldn't believe that. Nobody will believe that. You all have. And so what we've done is we've changed heroism from being this really magnificent, important thing to something quite simple. Doing something, getting involved, stepping up, being a part of the solution. That is heroic. And we did this because when we went to talk to people about volunteerism, a lot of people said, well, I don't feel appreciated. I did that work and nobody really said something to me. We need that validation. We need that encouragement. We need that sense of kind of wanting to be a part of something bigger that we feel good about. So think about things in terms of heroism. And so I wrote a book called Be the Hero, Be the Change, and I kind of did all of the things that I'm talking about, I described, but as I get about 3/4 of the way into the book, I talk about this concept of DASH. You know, we love to have our acronyms in the developmental world. And so I developed this, and DASH has 4 components: decide your issue, accept some responsibility, surrender, and help. And so let me just quickly go through these things. I've said it over and over again, and I'll say it one more time. We don't pick our issues, issues pick us. And if you don't know what your issue is, go out and find it. And it's easy enough to go out and just look at videos, to talk to people, to go to seminars, to work at Crossroads and other organizations until you find it. Try to figure out that thing that makes your heart sing, that gets you to have your heart either get excited because of the injustice or the excitement of being associated with this. But in order to know what it is that your issue is, you have to be open to looking at the world and the world's problems and accepting that I am going to find what it is about this world that really kind of resonates for me. The next thing we have to do is set some responsibility. The way the world looks at the world's problems is that government's got to take care of these. The NGOs got to take care of this. The UN has to. There are people out there who will do it. But as I've made the case, we are failing in every single endeavor. We breathe the same air, we drink the same water, we live in the same communities, we basically use the same resources. We have to accept some responsibility. And so let's say that, you know, this is your house and a big storm comes by and that tree happens to be on your lawn and it lands on your neighbor's car. You have to accept some responsibility. That is your space. What I'm saying is we have to allow for the space that we have set aside for holding responsibility to open beyond our yard, to our neighborhood, to our community, to our state, to our country, to our world. We have an infinite amount of compassion, an infinite amount of love, an infinite amount of being able to really kind of address the issues of our time. We have to open ourselves to that, and we have to make it part of our charge, part of our responsibility, part of what it is that we do as human beings living in this earth. Surrender. Now, I don't know how to describe this to people. That day when I surrendered, it was just kind of like, you know, I just can't not do anything. I have to get involved. And I felt like the moment I crossed over that threshold, The moment I gave up the resistance to this, the moment I accepted the responsibility, the moment I just said, this is what I'm going to do, transformation happened. And I say this transformation happens on the other side of surrender. Now, for those of you who have never experienced this, I hope you do. It is one of the most freeing, one of the most important feelings that you can have, because you basically said, I am going to not listen to those voices in my mind. I am going to accept the responsibility. I'm going to do things, and I'm just going to get on with it. I'm going to just get on with it. And it's just an amazing moment in a person's life when they have that type of thing take place. The last thing is just to do something. Just do it. You know, Nike got it right when they came up with that statement, just do it, because it's a call to action. And it's a call to action that almost says, don't think about things, just do it. Don't come up with excuses, just do it. Do something, do something, do something. Make it be a part of who you are. Make it be a part of what you do. Make it be a part of how you basically just kind of move from thinking that you're wanting to do something to actually do something. Okay, so usually when I get to a point in my presentation, and I often get in front of people and talk about human trafficking, and I give a particular lecture. And at the end of the lecture, I often say to people, if I could get each of you in this room to do just one thing, if 10 million people did one thing, that would add up to a lot. One of the things that you can do is to learn about a topic. And then I say to the audience, guess what? You've done your one thing. You don't have to do another thing. How easy was it? But if you go to 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 other people and tell them what you learned today, you've done a second and a third and a fourth and a fifth thing. How easy was that? If you teach people about it, because you now know about this, you've added value. So raising awareness is one of the most important things we can do for topics. It may not seem like it's much, but it's a lot. And if a lot of people were contributing to this and getting involved, it would really make a difference. Another thing is to join. And you guys are working for Crossroads. You're already in that situation. I don't have to talk to you about this. But participating and working with organizations makes all the difference. And volunteerism is a wonderful thing. It's a wholesome thing. It's a healthy thing in many ways. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But I also want to reiterate the fact that volunteerism can happen at every age. So I mentioned that there was this 9-year-old girl who was one of my interns. So this girl saw a documentary that I was in. I don't know how she got my email address, but she contacted me and she said, Mr. Friedman, I saw you in a documentary. I'm 9 years old and I want to help. Tell me what I need to do. I said, you're 9 years old. She said, so what? I said, you're 9 years old. She said, 9-year-olds are the new 16-year-olds. Give me a chance. So I said, what are you good at? She says that I can find anything on the internet that you want. I'm great at that. So I gave her an opportunity. I gave her some tasks, not expecting much, but within about a week, I had everything I needed plus a lot more. In fact, she was better than my second-year Yale law student at finding stuff on the internet, because that was her God-given gift. She applied what she felt like she was good at to basically volunteerism. And that's a really important point. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Donating and giving and fundraising, all of these things are really super important, and a lot more important now. You know, when it comes to COVID, a large percentage of NGOs that I worked with in Hong Kong and other locations are suffering. All across Asia, we're seeing NGOs that are closing down. The resources are being diverted to something else. This is a major problem at a time when most organizations need to be there. So donating to an organization really does make a difference. Fundraising for them is also important. To keep a girl in a shelter in Cambodia cost about $5 US a day. Maybe the state will pay for 2 weeks. Maybe they need another 2 weeks. And so skipping one meal in Hong Kong and taking that money and giving it to the right organization can make a big difference. Once again, contributing, being a part of the solution, offering something of yourself, these are all relevant and important. So when it comes to the 9-year-old girl, and when it comes to all of us, if we are able to help people, but also to use our God-given talent, You add these things together, and what we're really talking about is an amazing win-win proposition, which really does result in purpose. And so, if you are a public speaker like Greta and you use that gift, you can influence a lot of people. I've worked with people in the counter trafficking world who use dance to communicate the issue of human trafficking, or poetry, or they basically write articles, or they sell t-shirts. Whatever it is that is your inherent gift, whatever it is that you offer the world, basically, if you apply that to your volunteerism, it's a win-win because you benefit and the world benefits. But I'll say one other thing. When we take on volunteers, we use two criteria. One criteria is that you're already doing something, you want to apply your experience and your skills. The other one is a person wants to learn something new. We had an airplane pilot that worked for my organization who was laid off. He always wanted to learn how to do computer programming. So he approached us and said, I want to work with the Macon Club, but I want to build this skill. Will you allow me to do so? We said yes. He developed this amazing dashboard that is one of our tools. It demonstrates that we can learn and apply these types of things. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just sum up now with a couple more stories. Years ago, when I was in Nepal, I desperately wanted to do something to help address modern slavery. So I decided to write a book. As part of this book writing process, I basically went from shelter to interview the women and the girls. I went to one shelter and there was a girl named Gita, and every time I approached her, she said, no, I don't want to talk to you. But she sat and listened to every one of the other stories. When I finished there, I got up, I was leaving. Gita comes running over and says, I changed my mind. You can have my story. I said, that's great. So Gita sat on one side of the table, the rest of us sat on the other side of the table, and over a 3-hour period, she told the worst story I'd ever heard of rape and torture and disease, everything I had heard times 10. I honestly didn't know what to say to this girl. Finally, I turned to her and I said, wow, Gita, you must be so angry at the traffickers for the horrific things they did to you. She paused and paused and paused. And then she said, no, I'm angry at you and you and you. Where were you? She said that every single day she woke up praying for somebody to come. Nobody came. She said she went to school till she was 12. She knew that everything around her was right out in the open. Nobody was doing anything. She said she wasn't angry at the traffickers. She said they're just bad people being bad people. She said she was angry at the good people, at society for allowing a 15-year-old girl to be commercially raped 7,000 times only to eventually get HIV/AIDS. Now, I tell the story because Gita inherently understood the points that I was trying to make, that we are not going to be able to solve the issues of the world unless we get the world, the general public, the people of the world to step up and be a part of the solution. In the absence of this happening, we are not going to be able to make much of a difference. And you've seen the statistics to support that. And so I often hear people say, well, Matt, the world is only helping 0.2% of the victims. It's really impossible to make much of a difference. Okay, so my response, and it's a hypothetical response, is this. And listen to my reasoning on this. Imagine if there was a meteorite that was going to hit the Earth, an asteroid, something, and it's big enough that it would wipe the world out. But we were told that if we could end modern slavery in 2 years prior to this happening, the asteroid would go to the left or to the right. Now, do you think that the world would figure out how to address modern slavery? You bet they would, because of self-interest, because of self-survival, because they would recognize that if they did this, that something would happen. Now, the point that I'm making here is the motivation that is needed is not strong enough to get lots of people to do this, but it is within the realm of possibility if we had a scenario like this. Another thing I often talk about is the importance of small things in large numbers. This is a kind of almost the equivalent of a pyramid-sized sand dune in Africa. Look at the size of this thing, but it's made up of tiny little bits of sand, but in huge numbers. And the point of this is to demonstrate anything in huge numbers, whether it's something small, can add up to something big. So if we could get everybody to step up and volunteer, and if we could get 10 million people to do one thing or two things or five things, or make it 100 million people, it would add up to something quite big, something quite important, something quite relevant. When it comes to volunteerism in general, there's one other thing that I have to say is that volunteerism basically has many positive dividends. It's not about just being in a soup kitchen and doing something really grueling and giving up of your time. Most people have health benefits. They find it to be fun. It contributes to their happiness because endorphins are going off in their mind because something about volunteerism basically taps into that. It allows us to learn, to make friends, to be a part of a community, to develop confidence. There are many things that come from this. And in fact, my life started from volunteerism, my professional life that I'm doing now, and I wouldn't have changed a single day of my life. Every single moment of that volunteer process to where I am now has been precious, and it's contributed to my personal growth, my professional growth, and everything else about my life. And it's given me a sense of purpose. I've had somebody come up to me and basically say, and this has really stuck with me, what if on your last day on earth, the person you became was to meet the person you could have become? And I've always felt this is kind of a sobering statement because I think all of us have the potential to do so much more in our life. Life interferes, a lot of our habits interferes, but we can all do more. And certainly volunteerism allows us to reach that. I'm going to end with one last story, and that is I was in Washington, D.C. at a banking conference, and after doing a presentation, a banker comes up to me and says, "I want to talk to you, Mr. Friedman." I said, "Okay." We went off to the side. He said, "You know, I live in the United States. I was going from one part of the country to another. I had my two teenage daughters and my wife. We were driving. We got about halfway to where we needed to be. We stopped to rest. We went into a motel. After I got them tucked in, I was going out to get food, and I saw this 14-year-old girl being dragged into a room. I knew it had something to do with prostitution. I was very upset because I had teenage daughters, so I went to the manager of the motel, not knowing if anything would happen. Sure enough, 20 minutes later, a police car came. 20 minutes after that, this guy was being taken out in handcuffs. The girl had some women around her. She was taken away in an unmarked car, presumably to a shelter. He said, that was a milestone in my life. It was one of the most important things that I ever did in my life. So I turned to this guy and I said, well, what do you do? He says, I'm a banker. I said, yeah, I get that. You're at a banking conference. But what do you do within the banking world? He says, well, basically, I do compliance work, risk assessment. I look at potential nefarious, illegal activities. So I asked him, do you ever deal with human trafficking? He says, yeah, we do those cases all the time. We find them and when we send the information to the authorities. So I looked at this guy and I said, dude, you do this all the time. You're talking about that one case that you happen to be there, but by you doing your job, you basically add value to making the world a better place. Now, what was really interesting to me was this guy never really made that connection. It was an epiphany for him. He was like, oh, wow, nobody really ever said that. So a couple of months later, I was in Singapore on stage. There was 650 bankers there. I told them that story. Afterwards, I had about 30 people come up to me and say, wow, didn't make the connection with the fact that, yes, we are contributing. Yes, what we do is heroic. Yes, we are part of the solution. Now, I tell this story because it's really important for people to understand that you are already heroic. You have been heroic through your entire life. You maybe haven't given yourself the pat on the back that you deserve, but by encouraging yourself through your heroic acts and encouraging others and helping the world to understand that collectively we need to come together as a world to solve the issues of our time, to heal the world, to make the world better, things are going to get much better. And we have to walk away with that understanding. And I hope I made the case for that. Just so that you know, the book that I mentioned is Be the Hero, Be the Change. We do a lot of presentations, consulting, coaching on this for corporate social responsibility offices for different organizations and so forth. With that, I'll end. Thank you very much.